Welcome to Eat, Sleep, Wine, Repeat, a podcast for all you wine lovers who, if you're like me, just cannot get enough of the good stuff. I'm Yanina Doyle, your host, brand ambassador, wine educator, and sommelier. So stick with me as we dive deeper into this ever-evolving, wonderful world of wine. And wherever you are listening to this, cheers to you.
Hello, wine friends, and welcome back to part 2 with Doug Wregg, director and buyer at Les Caves de Pyrene, who, through bringing in natural, organic, biodynamic wines for the last 30 years into the UK, has made him a real authority in this field. Now, today, we're talking about the wines of Oregon, so a wine region nestled in the Pacific Northwest, lying between California to the south and then Washington to the north. In fact, several of Oregon's AVAs, so American Viticultural Area, straddle both Oregon and Washington. So Walla Walla and Columbia Valley, there you can find some great Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Syrah, and then there's the cooler Columbia Gorge, where you can find more Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. But Oregon, in general, is renowned for its diverse and exceptional wines, particularly famous for its world-class Pinot Noir, followed by Pinot Gris and then Chardonnay. And that is because 2/3 of the wines come from its most famous AVA, Willamette Valley. And then there are 11 AVAs to discover within this region. Several will be touched on today. But you have South Oregon's Umpqua Valley and Rogue Valley to check out. But Oregon is a region of really varied microclimates and soils, and there's even the Snake River Valley AVA, which is very desert-like, and that straddles Idaho, and apparently is making some pretty good Syrah and Viognier. But one of the biggest reasons why we are talking about Oregon today is their huge commitment to sustainable and organic farming practices. So Doug is going to be taking us on a journey of Oregon's history and how it has grown up through the years. We will be tasting a Pinot Noir and a Chardonnay. Both, can I say, blew me away. I think the Chardonnay may be in my list of favourite Chardonnays ever. Now, check out the show notes to see where you can purchase them. Equally, you will find the link to the transcript there so you can follow along. And all that leaves me to say is a big thank you to my sponsor of this season, Wickham's Wine. There's a link also in the show notes. Do pop across to their site, because if you're in the UK and it's your first time there, just use the code EATSLEEP10 at checkout for 10% off your first order. Right, pour yourself a glass of tasty wine and enjoy the episode. Now, I asked you, what kind of wine region do you really enjoy talking about at the moment? And you mentioned to me Oregon. So tell me, what is it about Oregon that has you excited now that people should know about?
Well, talking about natural wine and Georgian wine or whatever, then we go to the opposite end. So we come to like modern wine. And Oregon is, in effect, it's a sort of 50, 60-year-old wine culture. And it's really interesting to see with New Zealand as well, I suppose, like they don't have hundreds of years of wine growing and winemaking to fall back on. So how does that wine culture develop, and in what direction it develops, and how is it perceived in other countries? So yeah, I visited a few times and sort of fell in love with Oregon as a place, or at least the sort of wine growing area of Oregon, and the people as well, who are just so fantastic. A lot of them, they're not like professionals necessarily, but they have such interesting background stories, and they apply their philosophy, of wine to their winemaking. It's not sort of like sometimes people say, like customers say to us, oh, like, have you got a Californian wine? By which they mean Chardonnay or Cabernet Sauvignon or something like that. And then I don't think they have a really clear idea of what an Oregon wine is. And I think in Oregon, it's on such a steep learning curve that I think the progress I've seen in the last even 15, 20 years, well, the last 5 years probably, has been huge. So I'm always intrigued to feel the energy of of a new wine region.
I mean, I was looking at Oregon recently. Okay, you're going to talk about it. Let me go and have a quick look again. And I was surprised by actually how many AVAs they are. And I was like, there's about 23 now. And realistically, if people are starting to get to know Oregon, they're going to know about the Willamette Valley because, I mean, 2/3 of the producers, they're there. And loads and loads of the AVAs are within that. But there was a few that I hadn't even heard about that only a few years ago have become an AVA. And you then realize, my God, okay, there's so much energy, there's so much movement and development and understanding of their own terroir, their soils, for them to be creating these much smaller AVAs within a much bigger AVA. You talked to me about earlier, there is an interesting history of Oregon. So it really is literally about, 50 years old, since the 1960s. That's when Pinot finally got planted.
Yeah, well, I suppose that you have to really go back, so I suppose that the first vines actually in Oregon were planted in 1847. And not a lot of people know this, by a guy called Henderson Loyling. He brought them over, or came over in this sort of covered wagons with thousands of cuttings of fruit and nuts and trees on the so-called Oregon Trail from Missouri to Oregon. And they were first planted, I think, in a place called Milwaukee in Oregon. And then this guy and various other people sold rootstock to farmers up and down the whole length of the West Coast. And these were the mother plants for, you couldn't call it a wine industry because it was very much not a wine industry, but it's pretty small. Then I think between roughly 1850s, 1860s and 1919, there was a lot of German immigration. Families came and settled in the sort of steep river valleys in the state. So in the Applegate and Umpqua valleys, there were the Britt family, von Prestes family, Derner families, and in Willamette Valley, Reuter and the Wirtz families. And they put down their roots and they planted vines, and they thought this is prime vineyard land. And they really believed that Oregon would be like the next Rhineland. That was their origin. In 1904, the guy Frank Reuter, who was in the Willamette Valley, won a silver medal for his Riesling at the World Fair in St. Louis, Missouri.
1904?
1904. And then what happened?
Well, we had Prohibition. Yes.
So all the vineyards were ripped out or just lay fallow. Prohibition was 1920 to 1933, I think. And the commercial wine industry completely vanished. So that's 2 generations of grape growers and winemakers were lost into that period. No new vineyards were planted between 1919 and 1961, when a guy called Richard Sommer planted a wide assortment of grape varieties in the Umpqua Valley. This is like south of the Willamette Valley. And he planted mostly Riesling. So maybe Riesling is the origin grape there, and Cabernet Sauvignon, with small parcels of Gewürztraminer, Syrah, Carignan, Pinot Noir, and Sauvignon Blanc, and Chardonnay, of course. So the first planting of Pinot Noir in Oregon was, in fact, accredited to Richard Sommer. And he's famous for that. But, of course, that really belittles his grand achievements, which is you could say he's the first or the forefather of modern Oregon wine. And his first wine was a Riesling in 1963. So then, roughly at the same time, Charles Corey and David Lett, you would say that they are the 3 wine pioneers in terms of the impact they've had on the rest of the Oregon wine industry. And then other families, known often as founder families, we deal with one, so-called Blossers, the Ponzis, the Erats, the Adelsheims, the Fullers, they're all in the Willamette Valley. And then there was various ones in the Umpqua. But in 1970, there was just one vinifera winery in the whole of Oregon, just one, and less than 100 acres of vines planted to vinifera varieties. By 2010, already 418 wineries with 20,000 acres in 848 vineyards. Now, over 1,000 wineries and well over 1,000 vineyards. And of course, winemaking and wine tourism is a vast commercial thing for Oregon. So that's the background. But, a few people, but even in the mid 70s, there was nothing really until famously in 1979, David Lett, who I referred to earlier, he entered his 1975 Erie Vineyards, that was the name of his vineyard, Reserve Pinot Noir, and he took 10th place in a blind tasting at an event in Paris called the Wine Olympics.
Love the name.
By French magazine. goat meal. And this sent shockwaves around the wine world, either real or contrived, we don't know, especially in Burgundy, who are fiercely defensive, well, as were the Bordelais. But this was like Pinot Noir is like, it's sacred to Burgundy, isn't it? Of course. So Robert Durand of Maison Domaine Durand famously demanded a rematch. And this is like the stuff that history is built on, these little stories. And out of the wine station of blind tasting, the same 75 Erie Vineyards Pinot Noir came second to 1959 Durand Chambon Musigny. And once word got back to Oregon that basically this wine had like conquered the world, more or less, then people really got behind Pinot Noir as a grape variety in a way that sort of dictated the next like 20 or 30 years of wine growing, and the notion that Oregon equals Pinot Noir and falsely Oregon equals Burgundy. And the fact that it came from the Dundee Hills put the perception that Dundee Hills was the center of Pinot Noir territory. But one little aside, which I think is really funny, is the wine that came first and the second worldwide was Tyrrell's Pinot Noir from Australia. And that could have been the moment that Australia became like Pinot capital, but wasn't. And what in fact happened was the Durand family decided to plant their first vineyard outside of Burgundy in the heart of the Dundee Hills and won awards for their Oregonian Pinot Noir. And really the rest is history. And then like people came from all over the world. So you had the original founder families, but then you had a lot of investment from France, basically.
It's absolutely fascinating, though, how quickly this whole wine region has kind of exploded. And if I'm right, you've mentioned the founders, the names that came and said, you know what, we're going to plant. This is not a ideal grape growing region. The summers are cold and they're wet. And apparently from when I was looking into this, a lot of the advice from UC Davis in California was saying to everyone, don't plant any grapes here. This is a really, really bad region to plant grapes. And thankfully it is. It's like so many regions, even in England. Don't plant grapes, just stick to apples. It's too cool.
Well, Charles Curry and David Lett, I think they went to UC Davis.
Yeah.
But then what they did was they've traveled across Europe and they tasted wine and brought back their favorite cuttings. Or, like we're called suitcase cuttings. Like, so Charles Curry brought back clone of Pinot from Alsace, which is now called the Curry clone. Goodness knows where the origin. We think it's Alsace anyway. Switzerland, the Wädenswil clone of Pinot Noir. But then Charles Curry also planted a vineyard called Davis. Well, I can't remember what it's called, Davis Vineyard, but just 30 different grape varieties, of which Gewürztraminer, Semillon, Cabernet Sauvignon, Sauvignon Blanc. These were like really important. And then, of course, you still have the heritage of Riesling and whatever. But if you look at the total plantings now, 59% of all plantings in Oregon are Pinot Noir, which is incredible. And much of that, of course, is the Willamette. Then the next grape down is Pinot Gris at around 14. Then Chardonnay, only 7. And Chardonnay has been bolstered by the fact that everyone's mad about sparkling wines there. Oregonians love champagne, but they love to make Syrah. Then Syrah, then Cabernet Sauvignon. 1% Riesling. And for me,
1%.
I've tasted a lot of Riesling from Oregon. I think it's only 1% of production. Like, why would it be? And altogether, 100 different grape varieties are grown now across all of Oregon, basically. And there are a lot of nurseries sort of letting out things. There's a lot of grafting onto Pinot rootstock as well. So like you'll find like Manthea, for example, Grüne Veltliner, Albarino. The thing is, like when I first went to Oregon, we got the usual guff about, this is an incredibly cool climate region. It's so difficult. And it's like, oh yeah, you got Champagne as the coolest, then Oregon, then Burgundy, then whatever. And I thought, I'm standing outside, it's like 110 degrees. And then I said, when was the last like normal vintage you had? Like a typical, like cool? Oh, this is 2010. I said, like, that was 8 years ago. You mean like every vintage is like been hot, whatever? And they said, yeah, basically. And then literally one vintage in the last 20 has been like a normal, long growing season. Because the whole thing was you were able to harvest Pinot Noir into October. No, they're terrified if they don't pick in August or beginning of September. So everything has changed. And it's no way is this like a cool climate. And just because they grow Pinot Noir doesn't mean it's cool climate. It means they have to think really clearly what they're going to do. Remember, most vineyards in Oregon are really low altitude, like 150 meters is 200 meters is pretty high. Do they plant higher up? They're so worried about ripening Pinot, whereas I don't think this is a problem. I don't necessarily want super ripe Pinot, but they want their Pinot to come in at proper full ripeness, 14.5%. It's a long way away from Burgundy, but Burgundy is suffering exactly the same problems. It's so hot year after year that Pinot, which is a very fragile grape after all, needs to be respected. You need to sort of tone it down. You need to sort of it's not about maceration. It's not like a white wine where if you get that sort of ripeness, you can play. The white grape variety is your palate. Whereas a red grape variety, it's too delicate, especially Pinot Noir, which it needs certain weather conditions. I think you need to be in the vineyard constantly, sort of nurturing the vines. Then it's much more problematic than it used to be.
Well, that is just echoed across many of the vineyards of the world now, isn't it? So you've touched on Pinot Noir. So of course we have to now taste a Pinot Noir. Tough times for me. So you sent me the Beckham Estate. So anyone who likes David Beckham, maybe this is a good gift as well, just on a side note. Nothing to do with him, I assume. And this is the Creta Pinot Noir. What vintage? 2021. So this comes from the Willamette Valley, but it's within the Willamette Valley. Again, another newer AVA, which probably I can't pronounce it. Am I going to kill it? Chehalem Mountain.
Chehalem, yeah.
Chehalem.
Chehalem Mountain's AVA, and this is from a vineyard on the Parrot Mountain. It's called. There's P-A-R-R-E-T-T, not Parrot. But I chose this for 1,001 reasons, basically. One is it seeks into the whole idea of making wine in clay pots. And I think this is unique. If you actually see this is a vessel called a novum, which is pioneered by the guy who made the wine. So Andrew Beckham is a ceramicist, taught pottery, local high school, was passionate, loved wine, and decided to work stages in wineries and do vintages, and decided to plant around his house a bunch vineyards to Pinot Noir, to Trousseau, to Aligotti, to Sauvignon, and farm them regeneratively, biodynamically. But he was already making clay pots of all shapes and sizes, including Cavevri, Georgian style, including Tinajas, and including this his own pioneered novum, which he now exports all over the world.
Interesting.
Making wine to put in his own clay pots. And he's one of the most respected potters, in the whole of the wine world. And people come to him advice and buy his particular vessels. What I love about this is it's Pinot Noir in alliance with clay. And if you have a clay pot, your fermentations last much longer, much cooler, much slower, much more even. And you get this beautiful extension of flavor. Also by using clay and not by using new wood, which a lot of producers will use. There's no punch downs and pump overs. It's so easy and seamless and fine and fresh and elegant, delicate as well. When Pinot's like this, I really love it because I don't like this quite cakey black fruit extraction. For me, it's gone over. I love the red fruits and I love the acidity to describe a line underneath it. And I think when you get long, cool fermentations, you get this thing. And it's they're ambient fermentations, not there's no temperature control in the cellar. It's just the clay is the way it acts as an insulation and the way there's a sort of biodynamic motion within the vessel. And then, nothing really added. It's a natural wine, but it's a great introduction to sort of Pinot.
I love this wine and I love native yeast, unfiltered. This is a natural wine aging in these clay pots. And, in your head, when people go, oh, natural wine, it's so funky, there is actually not a single touch of anything off, only fresh fruits and the most fine tannins. It's an absolutely beautiful expression of Pinot. I love Les Caves de Pyrene because that's what you focus on. Natural wines, minimal intervention. But so many natural wines are funky because perhaps somebody's trying to follow the trend. It hasn't been stored properly. It's just not a very good example. There are loads of them out there. And then people have just this idea, and me too. I don't like funky wines. I don't like my wine to taste like cider, and so many do. But when I know that you've brought them in, you're so good at choosing people who just want to showcase the vibrancy and their terroir. And I think if you have really, really good fruit and experience, the wine continues to taste like wine, and people should not be scared that it happens to be natural wine, because I wouldn't know with this bottle at all.
I think the better you farm, the better the wine tastes as well. That's always my precept for natural wine is that, yeah, you can make it 0 sulfur or whatever, but doesn't mean it's a good wine. If you have beautiful grapes, farm well, and you very responsive in the winemaking, and a lot of tasting, a lot of feeling the way the wine wants to do and where to go, then you've got it, basically. But I would never say like, oh, a wine is good because it's natural. A wine can be interesting because it's natural. But ultimately, I think most winemakers, and this is perhaps the biggest fallacy, is that a lot of critics think that natural winemakers are just obsessed with like the title, obsessed with like belonging to a group. But actually, no, they want to make delicious wine. And their mentors, like Andrew's mentor is Elisabetta Fodadori. Well, what a great mentor. Just delicious wine, wines you want to drink, wines that give enormous pleasure, wines that have finesse and freshness and elegance and all those sort of like nice abstract qualities. I don't think people necessarily want to make vinegar. It's not a commercially good idea, but it's also, if you don't want to drink your own wine, why would you make it? So I think it really has to start from that thing. And of course, there are people jumped on the bandwagon and say, look, I can make a natural wine, but that's not really the point. It's like, does it stack up as a wine?
Everybody listening, if in doubt, just check to see if the wine is with Les Caves de Pyrene, and then you know. It's been Doug approved. Doug approved means not yuck. This has these lovely wild strawberry notes, a little bit of kind of tea leaves. So lovely fruits, but much more mellow. And also that's going slightly towards the earthiness without it being too savory, because I still think it's much more on the fruit spectrum. For me, actually, I haven't drunk Oregon for a very, very long time, because actually Oregon, when I first started in the wine industry nearly 15 years ago, actually was a little bit cheaper. And now it's skyrocketing because, I mean, they're really doing fantastic jobs. And it's now become, cult statusy even. But when I was tasting Oregon before, I used to always feel like the Pinots had this lovely like Parma violet floral note going through them. That was just something I noticed. But yet I don't think that is true now. I think these are slightly rounder. This is still a medium body wine. Do you feel like you can categorize the style of Pinot from Oregon? Keep in mind, actually, it's quite a large area, comparing it to other places in the world. What are your thoughts there?
Not really, because there are a lot of different terroirs in Oregon. So here we're on volcanic jewelry and sound addition soil, sort of like they're volcanic soils. They didn't come from the erupting volcanoes in the Cascade Mountains. They came from, like the big lava flows that sort of created like sort of basalt layers over marine sedimentary. And that gives a certain sort of sanguine quality to Dundee Hills wines, particularly, which is full of that sort of soil. Here it's a little less so, but you get into other places, Yola Amity, you get these more windblown soils and suddenly you get like freshness and more lighter styles, and then et cetera, et cetera. It's incredible. Like in Burgundy, like two neighboring vineyards will have two different profiles. The same in Oregon. There is one slightly cooler part of Oregon as well. It's in the Willamette, and it's called the Van Duzer Corridor, which has now got its own AVA. Unbelievable.
Of course it does.
Tiny. Yeah, it's just tiny. But basically, it's a gap in the coastal range, which allows cold Pacific air to blow in. And anywhere in the corridor there is a noticeably cool climate. Whereas a lot of Oregon vineyards were planted originally to face away from the ocean and more towards the center, more towards the east and north. And this is where all the hot air is coming from. So increasingly with global warming, we're seeing a lot of hot weather events coming from the deserts of eastern Oregon and further east than that. And I think like that's not ideal for Pinot Noir, basically. But I think also, and maybe it's like people like David Lett and other people, a move away from the slightly classical style of winemaking, which is destem, lots of like pump overs and punch downs to get extraction, to like more whole cluster. Even if it's not 100%, it's 20, 30, 40%. That gives this lovely stemmy freshness, longer, slower fermentations. the move away from 100% new oak, unbelievable for Pinot. But I mean, like, but people were really up at that level, certainly 40, 50, 60, and more towards 20% or even new oak. That was a bit revolutionary, that people would not extract and not hit the wine with heavily charred barrels. But if you think that the main audience for Oregon wines is California and Canada, I mean, these are and they just love big wines there, big, bold, powerful wines. And Pinot Noir was just something, people saw sideways or whatever. It's a great advertising gimmick, but that's not what Oregon is about. Oregon was about incredible variety of terroir, reflection of really healthy, pristine fruit from organic and biodynamic farming. Oregon is the epicenter of biodynamics, probably, in the whole of the States, and where Demeter was founded, Demeter USA in 1931 or 32. So it's and it's got the LIVE, schemes. It's got so many organic schemes. It's so much about small winemakers, small family wineries, incredibly limited production. 4,000 cases is sort of where it's at. Yeah, there are a couple of bigger wineries, but it's nothing like California and nothing like so many others, like more industrial winemaking countries. And then, land and labor costs are really high. Minimum wage is really high in Oregon. There's a lot of cost factors, but they're quite proud about. So the average price for Willamette Pinot Noir is like $50. So that's way more than a Californian Pinot Noir on average, or a New Zealand Pinot Noir. So it sort of pitched itself, and it's not going to go back the other way. The only direction it might go is away from Pinot a bit, and to discover that actually with climate change, white grape varieties are definitely the way to go. And some red grapes as well. So.
Interesting. I want to touch on two things you've talked about there. So one being about, experimenting, going away from Pinot Noir. In Portland, what I find fascinating, what I would love to do is visit at some point, and flying into Portland makes a lot of sense. And there's become, over the last 10, 15 years, this real massive urban winery scene. A lot of the wineries from Willamette Valley, which is obviously just south, have even brought their tasting rooms there. So there's a real culture now for experimentation, a lot of energy, food and wine. Have you spent time in Portland?
Yeah. And there are some small urban wineries there. And obviously when you get to the wine country, as it's called, the Dundee Hills, then, big tasting rooms. And when you have a big tasting room, you're getting loads of weddings and functions. You make every bloody grape variety you can. It's for tasting room sales. It's not really for export. So yeah, your bread and butter is your Pinot Noir and your sparkling, but then you might make it, 15 other different bits and bobs. Yeah, Portland is sort of, I don't find it that winey a city. I mean, yes, there are some urban wineries, but actually, if you go and eat and drink in Portland, you notice that everybody loves growers champagne. It's an obsession, and I think a lot of winemakers now in Oregon are making sort of sparkling wine from Pinot and Chardonnay. They love Italian wines, and they love Barolo, and they whatever. So I think, if you go into any classy restaurant, this is what you see on the list. Yes, of course they support local growers, but this sort of urban wine phenomenon, which there's 2 or 3 fantastic whatever, and it's just because they're sharing a warehouse space with artists and other people. It's a big thing in California as well. It's when you have no money to make wine, you just perch in some little space. And increasingly, because of the cost of everything, there's contract crush facilities and so on and so forth. But I think even the people who work in urban wineries, you think, oh, where's the origin there? Where's the vineyards? But they all work with organic and biodynamic producers, and they're all really keen to talk about the vineyard where the grapes are sourced from and their feeling for the wine. So one urban winery I know, they just specialize in Riesling. Another one just specializes in Loire grape varieties like Cabernet Franc and Melon and Cabernet Sauvignon. And it's like, wow, these are not what I thought Oregon was about, but actually it shows the potential of what it could be.
Super, super interesting. Well, you've just touched on the fact that what I was going to ask you, the second thing, which is how green it is. As a sommelier back in the day when I was selling Oregon wine, I would always touch on, I feel like this is one of the greenest wine regions of the world, because no matter what winery I was buying from, they were always had some salmon safe accreditation. They had livestock on their properties. There seems to be such a proudness and such a beautiful focus that everyone's doing things as sustainably as possible. I know the world is paying more attention day by day, but Oregon seems to have been doing this for a really long time and nailing it.
Yeah, since 1973, there was a law passed which limited residential building and agricultural zones. And that raised the value of farmland hugely and encouraged vineyards to be planted. And now there's the LIVE, which is Low Input Viticulture and Enology Program. 47% of Oregon's vineyards are now certified sustainable, which is incredible. And I don't know how many are biodynamic certified, but there's got to be at least 50. And that's incredible concentration. I think probably only Alsace, I can think of any place in the world which has that, and maybe Austria, has a concentration of like organic and biodynamic status. But written in almost to the law of how you work is biodiversity, energy reduction, water management, recycling, workers' health, safety, improvement of the environment for the local communities. This is pretty well enshrined in Oregon law. And it's the first thing they talk about if you ever go to I went to Pinot Camp. Yeah, people from all over the world come and, mess around for 3 or 4 days and get to know a bit about Oregon. But they drum this home, like that Oregon set itself up to make the best wine it could with the least environmental impact. In fact, to make these things environmentally positive, to farm that way. And really to think about every single aspect, like totally green wineries, 100% solar powered, 100% recycling, 100% sort of, like using wastewater and so on and so forth. So, and yeah, you mentioned the salmon program as well. You need that sort of integrated philosophy. You asked me at the beginning, why Oregon? That's why Oregon. I love this sort of like friendly wine community, and they're always thinking about the environment. It's like, we make wine, but like we make wine within this quite rigid program of laws, and it's the right thing to do, not because, like we don't resent the fact that we have to work in this way. And how can we do it better as well?
Love that. Well, I want to get onto Chardonnay now, and maybe also talking about, you've mentioned another AVA, the smaller AVA, Dundee Hills, because it has quite a lot of history. So you've sent me a bottle of Kelly Fox wines, 2022. And this comes from a pretty old vineyard in terms of when it was planted. This is the Durant Vineyard Chardonnay and their Lark Block. So tell me why you chose this wine.
Well, I mean, I love Kelly personally. It's a friend. I think she's a bit of like a mentor for me. When I first visited, it was Oregon. It was really to see her we had a long sort of like rambling conversation about Pinot Noir and how I was perpetually disappointed by my favorite grape and I hated it. And she said, well, I like Pinot Noir, la, la, la. And the way she talked about it was so intriguing. I felt like, you know what, I got to taste her wines because she's like a real poet about, these things. And, she's quite spiritual person as well and really in tune with nature. And so I went and tasted the wines and fell in love with them. And I thought she really understands that wine is a natural product in the sense that not about no sulfur or anything like that, nothing to do with that, about it comes from nature. And like the more you're in touch with the vines, every single vine, the more you understand the vineyard, the more you make something or you allow something to be made or to happen that is totally reflective of that vineyard. And she is so in love with the particular vineyards that she works with. And she works with several, and, like people who have the same philosophy as her in terms of farming. So Durant is this particular vineyard. And I think she loves the Dundee Hills. It's a sort of like, she says it's got a like volcanic energy, and it was formed through these volcanic sort of like these lava flows from hundreds of millions of years ago. Anyway, when I first met her, all she made was Pinot Noir, basically. And her iterations of Pinot Noir were phenomenally different. I mean, again, it's like one was like almost rosé colored and almost sanguine and earthy, and one was a bit more darker and more driven, a bit like a Volnay versus a Pommard, is really sort of like, she would never say her wines are Burgundian, but there was a sort of Burgundian differentiation in styles, you could say, how different plots behave differently because of the soils and the age of the vines and whatever. After the dreadful year that was 2020, when there was, forest fires and huge smoke damage, she had to transition. She had to do something, as did so many wine producers who specialize in Pinot. So she started looking at alternatives, and eventually started working with other grape varieties. And I suppose her other favorite grape variety was Chardonnay. And because what she loves to drink is Gros Champagne, Blanc de Blanc, and Chablis, and Burgundy, whatever. But she likes a really fine, austere style of wine. Her wines, she loves austerity in her red wines, but she loves austerity in white wine as well.
Interesting. You're saying that because for me, the lean style of this wine, even with some texture, but it's lean, it is linear, and there's minerality. So she's really honing in then on exactly her palate and what she likes.
And, because I'm not a winemaker, I don't know how that comes out, but it really comes out in all the wines. I feel like her behind the wine, even though she would say she's the midwife. She's not actually the maker of the wine. But I chose this one because it's a vintage, which I think is a fabulous vintage, 22. Now, the previous vintage we had of that, 21, much warmer, well, it felt warmer, and it was much more Meursault-like. It had that slightly more verging towards the tropical, sort of peachy style. And this one is, I'm not a Meursault fan, but I love Puligny Montrachet. If someone says Puligny to me, this is this linear thing, that fantastic tension, and then almost this chalky minerality underpinning it, and then just a little lift of citrus. But not about the fruit. It's about the suggestion. There's real depth there. I mean, remember so many Oregon grapevines are on original rootstock. So yeah, it's relatively old vines. And then the way I think she treats this, it's all in cement. Well, she calls them amphora, uterine shaped amphora. And again, it's a very relaxing sort of medium to ferment and to raise a wine in. And we're so used to Chardonnay tasting of oak being whether it's the superimposition or whether it's the thing that's constantly in there. It's what's Chardonnay without oak? Well, this is Chardonnay without oak. It's Chardonnay, naked Chardonnay, basically. And I just love it because it reminds me why I used to love Chardonnay and then sort of fell out of love with it because I didn't like oak bombs and a New World style, heavy inverted commas. This takes me to other places. I mean, this is purity. And I guess I like wines to aspire to.
Yes,
almost
purity.
Minimalism, beautiful minimalism for me is the highest art form in wine. It's just when it's just stripped back to energy, almost dynamism, purity.
What I like sometimes about certain wines, we've hit on the words kind of mineral, chalky, linear. You said purity. It's so, so true. But then you actually feel like you don't need to describe it any more. There's this energy, this has this direction in your palate, but you're like, well, okay, yeah, there is a little lemony underpinning peach note, but it's irrelevant. It's the energy and this kind of direction of the wine. And I really, the cleanliness, the minerality and the purity of this wine, it's just really, really gorgeous. And again, absolutely magical wine. Wouldn't know it's natural, quote unquote. Ironically, there's not a single fault. I don't think there's any. We were talking about imperfections that actually can be quite enjoyable in the previous episode with, say, natural winemaking. No, this is so clean. This is so just magical and light and bright and pure.
It's very, and I sort of I felt a bit with the Beckham as well. There's some wines which Kelly would use this word, weightless. They're transparent and weightless. And the lack of showiness is what makes them truly beautiful. Whereas we started off with some orange wines in the previous sort of episode. And it's these are peachy and punchy and you can take a bath in them, these are like fine showers. These weightless wines fine showers. You just they're spray over your tongue and you just sense the energy, but you tend not to linger on them because they're just so direct in a way, and not at all obvious. But then, as Galileo said, wine is sunlight held together by water. And I feel like with wines like this, I feel that's what they are.
I think that is a beautiful summary. I think Oregon perhaps a lot of people on, California gets all the attention. Then people talk about, the Merlots, the Syrahs from Washington, which is just above Oregon. But Oregon is its own wine region. Obviously, there are a few AVAs as well that cross between Oregon and Washington just to confuse us. And that's why there's actually some phenomenal Syrahs and Cabernet Sauvignons from Oregon. But typically, I think if anybody wants to start exploring, there's loads to explore in Oregon. Willamette Valley and the AVAs within is probably, I think, a good place to start. You're going to find that more. But yeah, I love the kind of the focus that people are going for. These wines are stunning. Oh, what pricing roughly?
Oh, so these are, this is quite a grown up wine.
We're Oregon, everyone. Oregon's not cheap.
Yeah, no, Oregon prices, but also Oregon production. I mean, tiny production on some of these things. So I think the Kelly's going to be around 45 to 50-ish. And the Beckham would be around sort of that price as well, maybe a bit less.
And that is fine, because these are not wines that should just be opened up randomly just because you want a glass of wine. Actually, this is on a Sunday with somebody you love, when you're in a good mood and you've got the patience and time just to open them up and enjoy the bottle slowly. Totally.
I was invited by a local wine shop in where I live, and they said, can you show 5 wines on a Saturday to people who just come into the shop? And I said, yeah, sure. Like, what would you like me to show? And they gave me depressingly 5 boring, cheap wines. This is just what people buy because it will hit that price point. That's what they want to spend. And I said, can I take a wine from my friend Kelly? Because I'll paint pictures with it. And I know it's 3 times the price of the other wines. Anyway, opened the bottles. We only sell 1 wine. That was her wine. Because when you it's like, taste the difference, literally in capital letters. Taste the difference. It's like, this is a whole experience of a vineyard. This takes you to places. And I love wines. I mean, we didn't really talk about terroir, but I love wines that just take me to other places. It's like, it's cheaper than traveling. And you don't have to queue in airports.
Very, very valid point. Absolutely. Honestly, I think sometimes for anybody listening going, oh my God, these are really pricey wines. They are. And that's maybe also why a typical wine consumer doesn't really understand Oregon very well at all. But, we should be drinking slightly less, but we should be drinking better. And I always say, you would go to the theatre, you'd go to the football, and you drop 50 to 100 to, gosh, 150 pounds now on a ticket if you are going to see somebody like Beyonce, whatever it is. So it's like actually 50 pounds, between 2 people, 25 each, to have a moment, discuss, learn, pull up the computer as well, see where it is, find out what's special about the soil.
Yeah, it's a story. And also, if you spend more on wine, it doesn't mean it's better, but you focus a bit more on it, and
which is useful.
Yeah, and then if an experience is leads to an epiphany or a bit of a revelation about wine, that's something that you remember for the rest of your life. So most wine is disposable because we drink with food or get boozed up, and then there's these wines. It's like, well, okay, now I've learned something, and that's, you can't put a price on that, honestly. And I would much rather drink less and drink better, than use wine as fuel. Because if you think what goes into some of the bottles that we've tried today, it's a lot of work. It's not just 1 year. It's like 18 months to 2 years. It's all that farming and process, but it's also thousands of years of geography and geology and gastronomy and farming culture and everything.
Stop it. You're getting me so energized, because that's the whole point of wine, isn't it? And if we can drink as well a wine made by somebody who's caring about the land, that's thinking about how they take care of it for future generations, they're handling it so beautifully, their whole energy and their own focus is going in that wine, and it will be different this year compared to next. And it's this natural product that will evolve in the bottle, and it's traveled all over the world to get to us. And we just paid 25 to 50 pounds on the bottle, and we now get to sit down and think about everything that you just said and all the things that went into it and all the care and all the love and all the energy, and see how that feels on our palate. What magic, what wizardry is this?
Yes. That's why we're in the business.
Absolutely. And hopefully everyone listening now, you're either going to become in the business because, you're very, very welcome. There's space for you, or you're at least going to start enjoying wine even more and grabbing some extra special bottles. Doug, thank you. Thank you, because your passion shines through, and it's just really nice just to listen to some stories, learn a few bits and bobs as well, whilst I, of course, drink along. And I hope those of you listening are also drinking along as well. So, Doug, thank you. And I'll speak to you very, very soon.
Yeah, pleasure. Bye.
Take care. Thank you.
Take care.
Well, I hope you're now thinking about getting your hands on a bottle of Oregon wine. However, I'm ready to tell you what is coming next week. I'm talking with Tom Sergi, one of the well-known wine presenters who's often working with the three wine men, so Oz Clarke, Ollie Smith and Tim Atkin. He has recently been in Portugal and is about to release a wine book. So we will be starting conversations next week talking about the Barada wine region. Now, finishing off, as always, with a wine quote, I introduce you, if you haven't heard of her already, to Isabel Legaron, who is a master of wine, but also the founder of the Raw Wine Fair. And she said, "Natural wine is like a photograph that hasn't been retouched. It captures the vintage, the terroir, and the climate. It is the most authentic expression of a vineyard." Well, let me know what you think of natural wine. Do you have an opinion, or do you take it wine by wine? If every wine tasted like the two I've had today, oof, there would not be any argument. Now, as always, big request to like, subscribe, and leave a review, if possible, on your podcast app that you're listening to, and share this episode far and wide with all your wine-loving friends. Share the wine love. Now, wishing you an inspiring week ahead, and until next Monday, wine friends, cheers to you.